Among the many Palestinian nationalist organizations that emerged in the mid-20th century, the most influential was Al-Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat. Founded in the late 1950s, Al-Fatah sought to address what its members viewed as the displacement and political marginalization of the Palestinian people following the creation of Israel in 1948. The organization pursued two primary goals: the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and the elimination of Israel as a state in its existing form. Arafat's movement was rooted primarily in Palestinian nationalism and was influenced by socialist ideas that were popular among many anti-colonial and revolutionary movements of the era. Unlike later organizations that emphasized religion, Al-Fatah was largely secular in its outlook. Both Muslim and Christian Palestinians participated in the organization, as well as in the broader Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which became the leading political body representing Palestinian national aspirations. As the conflict with Israel continued and diplomatic solutions appeared elusive, some organizations associated with the PLO increasingly embraced terrorism as a means of advancing their cause. These groups believed that high-profile attacks could attract international attention, pressure governments, and keep the Palestinian issue in the global spotlight. Over time, terrorism became one of the most visible and controversial tactics associated with parts of the Palestinian national movement, helping to shape international perceptions of the conflict during the second half of the 20th century. Although the PLO under Arafat's leadership publicly stated that it sought a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many groups associated with the broader Palestinian movement carried out terrorist attacks during the 1960s and 1970s. These attacks were intended to attract international attention, pressure governments, and keep the Palestinian cause in the global spotlight. The most infamous of these attacks was the Munich massacre of 1972. During the Summer Olympic Games in Munich, Germany, members of Black September, a militant organization linked to Al-Fatah, entered the Olympic Village and seized members of the Israeli Olympic team as hostages. The crisis ended in disaster after a failed rescue attempt by German police. By the conclusion of the ordeal, 11 Israeli athletes had been killed, along with one German police officer. 5 of the 8 terrorists also died during the confrontation. The attack shocked audiences around the world because it brought political violence to an event that symbolized international cooperation and peaceful competition. Extensive media coverage ensured that the incident received global attention, making the Palestinian issue a topic of international discussion in ways that few previous events had accomplished. At the same time, the relationship between the PLO and such attacks was often politically complex. While the PLO officially endorsed diplomacy and negotiations, militant actions were frequently carried out by affiliated or splinter groups rather than by the organization itself. This arrangement allowed PLO leaders to deny direct responsibility for terrorist incidents while still benefiting from the publicity and international attention those attacks generated. As a result, the Munich massacre became one of the defining examples of international terrorism during the 20th century and demonstrated how politically motivated violence could command worldwide attention. By the 1980s and 1990s, the secular and socialist Palestinian organizations that had dominated the national movement for decades began to lose influence. Many Palestinians grew frustrated with the lack of progress towards statehood, while broader political and religious trends in the Middle East encouraged the rise of Islamist movements. As a result, groups that framed the conflict in religious rather than purely political terms became increasingly important. 2 of the most significant Islamist organizations to emerge during this period were Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ. Unlike earlier movements such as Al-Fatah, which emphasized nationalism and secular political goals, these groups viewed the struggle against Israel as both a political cause and a religious obligation. Their ideology drew heavily on Islamic principles and rejected efforts to permanently recognize or accept the existence of the State of Israel. Both Hamas and PIJ adopted terrorism as a central strategy in their campaigns. They carried out suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and other forms of violence aimed at Israeli military and civilian targets. Their leaders argued that these tactics were necessary to resist Israel and advance Palestinian objectives, while critics condemned them as acts of terrorism that targeted innocent civilians and fueled continued conflict. These organizations have also benefited from support from governments and outside actors in the Middle East. Funding, weapons, training, and political backing have often come from states seeking to influence regional politics. Some governments have supported these groups as a means of weakening rivals and maintaining pressure on Israel, while others, most notably Iran, have viewed support for such organizations as part of a broader effort to advance Islamist causes and expand their influence throughout the region. The rise of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad marked a major shift in the Palestinian movement. Whereas earlier organizations had generally framed the conflict in nationalist and political terms, these newer groups increasingly defined it as a religious struggle. This transformation helped reshape both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader nature of terrorism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Hamas is the most influential Islamist Palestinian organization to emerge from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, Hamas developed as a Sunni Islamist movement that combined Palestinian nationalism with a religious ideology rooted in Islam. Unlike earlier Palestinian organizations such as Al-Fatah and the PLO, which were largely secular and nationalist in outlook, Hamas framed the conflict as both a political struggle and a religious obligation. Hamas achieved significant political success in the early 21st century. In the 2005 Palestinian parliamentary elections, the organization won a majority of seats, giving it a degree of political legitimacy and popular support among many Palestinians. However, unlike many political parties that separate political activity from military operations, Hamas maintained its armed wing and continued to engage in militant and terrorist activities even after entering government. The ideology of Hamas differs sharply from that of the older PLO leadership. Whereas the PLO gradually moved toward negotiation and officially recognized Israel in 1988, Hamas has never formally recognized Israel's legitimacy as a sovereign state. The movement's founding charter described the conflict in religious terms and declared that jihad to reclaim the land of Palestine was a duty for Muslims. As a result, Hamas viewed the struggle against Israel not simply as a dispute over territory or national self-determination, but as part of a broader religious mission. This religious orientation distinguished Hamas from earlier Palestinian nationalist organizations. While groups such as Al-Fatah tended to focus on political goals and included both Muslim and Christian Palestinians, Hamas grounded its message primarily in Islamic beliefs and identity. Its leaders argued that religion should guide both political action and resistance to Israel. Although Hamas moderated some of its public rhetoric during the 2005 election campaign and did not explicitly call for Israel's destruction in its electoral manifesto, controversy remained over its long-term objectives. Many Hamas candidates and leaders continued to affirm that the principles outlined in the organization's original charter remained valid. Consequently, critics argued that Hamas's public political positions often differed from the more radical goals expressed in its foundational documents. The rise of Hamas marked a major transformation in the Palestinian national movement. By replacing many of the older secular and socialist organizations as the dominant force in Palestinian politics, Hamas helped shift the conflict from one centered primarily on nationalism and statehood to one increasingly influenced by religion and Islamist ideology. This change significantly shaped the course of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, emerged as another major Islamist organization within the Palestinian movement. Although smaller than Hamas in terms of membership, political influence, and popular support, PIJ has often been known for its uncompromising ideology and willingness to rely on violence as its primary method of pursuing political goals. Unlike some Palestinian organizations that have participated in negotiations or political institutions, PIJ has consistently rejected diplomatic solutions and maintained that armed struggle is the only legitimate path to achieving Palestinian objectives. The organization advocates the creation of a Palestinian state governed according to Islamic principles and views the conflict with Israel as a religious struggle rather than simply a nationalist dispute. For PIJ, political compromise and peace negotiations are unacceptable because they are seen as incompatible with its vision of Islamic resistance. As a result, the group has focused heavily on militant operations and has frequently carried out attacks against Israeli targets. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has also maintained close ties with Iran, which has provided support to the organization over the years. These connections have strengthened PIJ's capabilities and linked it to broader regional networks of Islamist movements and militias operating throughout the Middle East. Together, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad represent an important transformation in the history of Palestinian militancy. Earlier organizations such as Al-Fatah and the PLO were primarily secular, nationalist movements focused on questions of territory, independence, and self-determination. By contrast, Hamas and PIJ frame the conflict in religious terms, viewing it as part of a broader Islamic struggle. This shift from secular nationalist terrorism to religiously motivated jihadist terrorism significantly altered the character of the Palestinian movement and played a major role in shaping the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the late 20th century onward.